we have a great and a very interesting guest today. He's an American who lives in Australia and has been quite prominent in recent years, speaking about India. So, Salvatore Babones, yes?
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay.
Great to be
Good.
here.
Could you please tell us a few words about yourself? Because, as I said, it's an interesting mixture. Where does your interest in India come from, and how you've recently become very popular in that country? How did it come about?
Well, I'm an associate professor of sociology at the University of Sydney and the executive director of a new think tank we're starting called the Indian Century Roundtable. But I am American. I've been in Australia for 15 years. And I should note I also have an affiliation with the Center for International Studies in Warsaw. I've been working on India's democracy for the past 3 to 4 years. I'm working on a book on Indian democracy, and it's been fascinating working on it. I took up the challenge of a Polish political scientist, forgive my bad Polish, Adam Przeworski, who famously said that India is the unexpected democracy, that all quantitative studies of democracy would indicate that India should never have been a democracy, and that if it was a democracy, that the democracy should have failed long ago. And so I took up that challenge and said, well, what explains Indian democracy? Why is it succeeding where other developing countries, other countries of similar income levels and similar post-colonial backgrounds, have singularly failed to succeed? Now, that work was mostly under the radar screen. I was writing mostly for Western publications. I never sought fame in India, but I was invited to visit India for the first time, I should say, in November 2022, last November. And I had an interview at the India Today conclave in Mumbai with the journalist Rajdeep Sardesai. And that interview went viral all over India. So all of a sudden, I'm an India media personality, which is kind of, it's endearing, but kind of amusing to me because I always meant to be studying India, but being India focused, Western facing. I didn't never intended to be writing for Indians. I was writing for the West about India. So it's been really interesting becoming something of a celebrity in India itself.
Good. I wanted to ask you because I've read your article that you wrote about the Polish Law and Justice Party,
Mhm.
which is now ruling Poland, and the BJP and in India. So could you please elaborate a little bit on? I agree with some of your remarks, some I disagree, but could you please tell us the parallels that you found regarding both the West, the reception in the West of both
Mhm.
parties?
Well, the two parties are structurally parallel in many ways. The core of their ideologies is very different. Of course, the PIS is very Catholic in orientation. The BJP is very Hindu in orientation. But both parties have striking similarities in being first, grounded in religion and tradition in their own countries. Second, being the dominant political party in a system where the other parties are arrayed against them as disparate opposition parties. So the axis of Polish democracy today is of the PIS with multiple opposition parties that share nothing in common except their Kaczynski hatred in some sense. And in a similar way, the Indian opposition is a panoply of multiple parties that share nothing in common except their Modi hatred.
Yes.
Both the PIS and the BJP are unabashedly religious in their symbolism and in their policy stances. Both of them mobilize religious conservatism to win votes at the polls. Both of them have taken positions of victimhood vis-a-vis international liberals. Both of them vilify George Soros, for that matter. Both of them have been very upset by Soros-funded campaigns that they perceive to be undermining their own societies. And both have been vilified by the same international organizations, that is the Rise of Democracy Institute and other human rights organizations, have criticized both countries in very similar terms. So there are many parallels, structural parallels. The content of these two parties' policies may be different because they're operating in different environments, strikingly different national income levels, different histories. But the structural position of these two parties, to me at least, seems strikingly similar.
Yeah, that's interesting. And especially as you mentioned, both are represented in the West by either their own nationals who are more familiar with the West, and they
Yeah.
don't necessarily represent the opinions or the variety of opinions in that country. When you do your research, how do you find those opinions or the data that is more, let's say, that is more local and native, that foreigners maybe are not so familiar with? How do you find that data to prove your point that those
Yeah.
national intellectuals that are more familiar with the West, that they maybe don't represent, or maybe they don't mention, they omit it?
Yeah. First, we don't prove anything in the social sciences. We leave proof for the mathematicians. We do adduce evidence to support arguments in the social sciences. Now, I'm a comparativist. I'm not a specialist on India, nor am I a specialist on Poland. I'm a monolingual American. So my expertise is comparing across countries. It's not having deep expertise on any one country. And the approach I've taken to India has been thoroughly comparative. But I also have a background in measurement theory. That is, I'm a quantitative social scientist. I've published extensively on measurement theory and on international indices. And when I came to the democracy indices and their treatment of India, I recognized that the indices were thoroughly flawed. I mean, they're simply not well constructed, especially the Varieties of Democracy Institute Index, the one that's most widely publicized and most widely trusted, simply has terrible measurement properties. Now, those terrible measurement properties apply whether you're talking about India, Poland, or the United States. But those terrible measurement properties specifically affect India. Now, the indexes has 5 sub-indices of democracy. Of those 5 sub-indices, 2 are objective, 1 is semi-objective, 2 are purely qualitative, purely opinion-based. On the 2 objective indicators, countries like Vietnam, that have single one-party states, Hong Kong, can end up with a perfect score. And they end up with a perfect score on those objective indicators because the objective indicators merely ascertain, does a country have a pro forma democracy? Meaning, one of them, are officials elected? And second, according to the Constitution, and second, is the franchise universal? Well, 174 out of 179 countries in the world have a universal franchise. Right. So even China gets a 100% score for universal franchise, despite the fact that nobody can vote in China. But if people could vote legally, there are no restrictions on who can vote. So they get a perfect score. Okay, so when you come out of these 2 objective indicators, India scores fine, but so does China, so does Vietnam. That is, we would expect a country like India to be doing way better than China when it comes to objective indicators of democracy.
Yes.
In fact, we're on the same level. It's then when we get to the more subjective indicators. So the one indicator that's halfway house is free and fair elections. Now, free and fair elections in VDEM is operationalized not by a judgment, are the elections free and fair, but by a set of indicators that experts judge. Was the Electoral Commission, does the Electoral Commission have full control over elections? Was there violence at the polls? Is the Electoral Register a full register that everybody's on, or are there questions about it? Well, Hong Kong gets a perfect score on these. Now, in Hong Kong, you can't vote for anybody, but its elections are clean and well run. So Hong Kong's elections are incredibly efficient. There's just no real choice. So Hong Kong actually outscores India on free and fair elections. The only indicators in the VDEM 5 indicators that have anything that in any way differentiate between real elections and sham elections are their freedom of expression and freedom of association indices, sub-indices. Now, it's there where they rely on expert opinion. Do the experts in the countries say that their own countries have freedom of association and freedom of expression? And the people being surveyed are political scientists, prominent political scientists in those countries.
Okay.
Well, this is a subjective question. Do I have, is there
Yes.
real freedom of expression? Is there
Yes.
real uh, freedom of association? India's political scientists feel that the situation in India is catastrophic. I mean, they rate India as being among the worst countries in the world. Now, they're not directly comparing India to Pakistan. They're not directly comparing India to Sweden. Instead, they're just giving a number on each of these questions for India,
Okay.
and the Pakistan political scientists are doing it for Pakistan, and the Iran. But if we think about it, among democratic countries, most of them are relatively well-off, rich countries, and among democratic countries, academia reflects a basically liberal viewpoint. Most people who get
Yes.
into positions, okay, but who is able to be a political scientist in Iran? Who's able to be a political scientist if you're a political scientist in Ivory Coast, it's probably because you're a regime-linked figure who's been appointed to a professorship at a university. But from the external standpoint, you're the professor of political science at the University of Abidjan.
Yeah.
You're in the VDEM survey. So for relatively poor, relatively low quality democracies, we see many of them rating their own country better than India's political scientists rate India. Now, that wouldn't be such a problem if India was scoring very high on the objective measures. If you said, well, objectively, India has democracy, but subjectively, there are problems of freedom of association, India would land up in the middle. But everybody gets a top score on the objective indicators. Even Hong Kong, even Vietnam, even China get top scores in the objective indicators. So all of the differentiation in the VDEM comes from the subjective indicators. And that's why I say it's very poorly constructed from a measurement standpoint.
And
Okay.
also, you mentioned in your interviews that those people are then often asked to comment on and write
Yes.
op-eds or maybe comment in Western newspapers, and then we see, oh, this person probably is we should trust him. And then the Western newspapers, or, mainstream media, they kind of sign off on it, and then everybody thinks, oh, they did the research, they're reliable, right? That's what you said in your interviews.
Right. Well, look, the famous and notorious statement I made in my first viral interview in India was, quote, India's intellectuals are anti-India. Now, I
Yes.
didn't mean that as an accusation against a class of people. I meant that as an explanation because Indians believe that these low rankings on the Rise of Democracy Institute, these low rankings on press freedom, they believe that these rankings come from the West, that they're imperialist, that some Swedish expert has gone to India, ranked Indian democracy, and said bad things about it on the Rise of Democracy Institute rankings, which are based in Gothenburg in Sweden. And I was explaining to them, no, it's not Swedes who've ranked you low. It's Indians who've ranked you low. So my point was not to condemn a class. My point was simply that the people doing the rankings are not Swedish, are not American, are not British. The people doing the rankings are your own political science professors, or in the case of the Press Freedom Index, your own journalists. But beyond that, if we think of perceptions of India in the world, or perceptions of Poland in the world, we in the English speaking world only know about Poland or India or most non English speaking countries by seeing what the intellectual class in that country says in our newspapers. So if you think a minute, who's likely to write an op-ed in the New York Times? If we imagine, the editor of the New York Times is at a cocktail party in the Hamptons, and someone, is asking, "Oh, how are things going in India?" And someone says, "Oh, I could tell you about India. This. Is that person likely to be a conservative, highly religious, non-English speaking person from Gujarat? Or is that person likely to be an internationalist intellectual from the Congress Party Brain Trust?" Right. Well, it's much more likely to be the second. And we can imagine the same thing for Poland. That is, the internationalized English speaking class in each country are the people who are overwhelmingly likely to have access to American, British, and international news media. And so it's their opinions that get prioritized. On top of that, they're able then to cite, in kind of a circular sense, they can cite the Rise of Democracy Institute. And they can say, don't take my word for it that things in India are bad. The nonpartisan, independent Rise of Democracy Institute says things in India are bad. The independent, nonpartisan Reporters Sans Frontières says things in India are bad. But of course, those organizations are getting that opinion that India is bad from the very intellectuals who are then going and reporting it. So there's a self-referential circular reasoning here. Now, I don't think it's intentional. I don't think it's nefarious. I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think it is the simple artifact of the reality that in India, the currently governing party in India is a party that has risen in opposition to the intellectual establishment, the English speaking intellectual establishment in India. And as a result, of course, the English speaking intellectual establishment don't like it.
There is another layer to it, like that's the case, for example, in Taiwan and China to a different extent, that politicians, especially the Western educated ones in Taiwan, they say different things to the local audience and different to the Western media or when they go abroad. So then, if you're a Westerner, you have this impression, hey, this guy sounds reasonable. But then Xi Jinping says something different when he talks to his, let's say, people in the party in a closed door event. Or the same with the KMT, they go abroad, they say different stuff
Yeah.
about China than they say here locally in Taiwan. Okay, I also wanted to ask you a little bit, maybe that's a nice bridge to talk about China. What do you think about, that's basically the major foreign policy issue, I think, now for India. What do you think about the relationship with China? Where do you see it going in the near future? Do you see a danger? What's your take on that?
India is kind of the last man standing against China. The United States under Joe Biden has pursued a more conciliatory foreign policy with China. Excuse me. Not conciliatory in any absolute sense, but certainly more conciliatory than the Trump administration. Here in Australia, the new Anthony Albanese Labor government has been more conciliatory than the previous Scott Morrison Liberal government. We've seen in general a lot of countries pulling back from the confrontation with China that was the dominant narrative in the
Yes.
Trump years,
Yes.
except in India. In India, there's been no pulling back from that because China is pressuring India all along the frontier. It's called the line of actual control. The frontier between India and China. It's a poorly demarcated, not internationally agreed frontier. That's why I call it a frontier, not a border, because there's no actual definition. And the constant incursions from China across the border, or I just said it myself, across the frontier with India, create just a constant state of animosity between the countries. Now, in India, being a democracy, this results in extreme popular pressure on the government, any politician in India to be anti China. Even the opposition parties in India can't be seen to be conciliatory towards Beijing. Anything they say that can be interpreted as criticizing the current government for being insufficiently anti-China, that for them is an electoral catastrophe. So, India being a democracy, this China pressure has stoked an anti-China reaction. On the other side of the frontier in China, of course, there's no such popular anti-India reaction because it's not a democracy. There's no popular pressure on the government vis-a-vis India. India, in any case, is a second-tier problem for China. The U.S. relationship is always its primary focus. So you have this situation where, for India, the top number one problem is China. But for China, the top number one problem is America. It's a very asymmetric relationship.
Yeah, you also said, I think that's also a problem because you said that that's very interesting because you said the US can gain its influence because it's being invited to some, institutions or participation, but China has to buy it. And you also mentioned in one of the interviews the example of vice chancellor at a university. So could you please talk a little bit about how does China buy its influence abroad, how it bribes, and how academia, politicians versus the West, which is being more invited and kind of, it's more on a consensus based.
Yeah, I'd point people to my 2017 book, American Tiansha, Chinese Money, American Power, and the End of History. The fact is that the American system is very similar to what in Chinese history has been described as a Tiansha system, a all under heaven system that
Yes.
has China at the center as the middle kingdom. The Chinese name for China is Zhongguo, which is simply central state, or
Yes.
poetically translated as middle kingdom. Well, today the United States is the middle kingdom. The United States is the central state of the global system. And other countries buy into that system. That is, the US doesn't have to bribe other countries to be part of the global system. Other countries effectively subsidize the United States in order to be admitted into that system. And I'll just give the simple example that foreign investments in the United States tend to earn a rate of return that is on average 2 percentage points lower than US investments abroad. Okay. So continuously, the United States is making a profit off its relationship with other countries. And we can see that in Europe and certainly in the Middle East, with countries subsidizing the presence of U.S. troops. Donald Trump made a big deal about NATO countries not paying their way. Yet in Europe, every country in Europe that has U.S. troops, to my knowledge, pays a substantial amount for their upkeep, pays for the bases, wants U.S. troops in the country. China's position is exactly the opposite. China's is pay to play. China's Belt and Road Initiative is not based on any desire among countries to be closer to China. It's based on the desire of other countries to receive Chinese subsidies. So in Eastern Europe, there have been extensive Chinese subsidies for think tanks in Eastern Europe, then send their members to China to get free education or to have free trips and connections and conferences in China. But on a bigger level, China will invest in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but only if those countries will support China at the United Nations. But the minute the Chinese investment stops, the political support stops. So China, if we look at one key example to make this very practical, China invested an enormous amount in Sri Lanka under the now disgraced Rajapaksa regime that's been overthrown in Sri Lanka. China spent billions of dollars building a port in Hambantota, which was in the Rajapaksa's own district of Sri Lanka, effectively bribing officials in Sri Lanka, supporting development in Sri Lanka. But the minute there was a change of government in Sri Lanka, China's out, right? So all that money, from the Chinese perspective, all that money was wasted because countries are only continuing to engage in China as long as China subsidizes them.
Yes,
When the
and you were
subsidies
saying
stop, they don't
you were
want it
saying
anymore.
already 2 years ago or three during the pandemic that you were saying first, how does China finance all of its expansion? Where does the money come from? And yeah, as you just said, once it runs out, the support is gone. So how come? Because at that time it wasn't. I mean, some people were of a similar opinion, but most not yet. So where did you know back then that the money before the lockdowns, before the whole economic collapse now, how did you know back then that it's kind of coming and it's ahead of us, that China would slow down and the money might run out one day?
Oh, I spent the entire 2010s writing about China's deteriorating fiscal situation. I had a cover article in Foreign Affairs magazine in September 2011, in which I said that China's economic growth would cease around the year 2020, that is, by the end of the decade, and that China would face severe fiscal constraints when that happened. China was only rich and able to afford to purchase all these international luxuries, or for that matter, its defense purchases, the aircraft carriers, the fifth generation fighter jets, because it was growing at such a rapid rate that there was constantly more money available. That is, every year in the from 2010, well, actually from 2002 or so through 2017, China was spending more and more every year, but every year its tax income would be equal to its spending from the previous year. So it was like going up a ladder or a set of stairs. Yes, they're spending too much, but next year they can pay it off. Spending too much, but next year they can pay it off. Until the growth stopped. Now, I expected the growth to stop based on a structural model of understanding Chinese growth. China was not growing because it had especially good economic management. The idea that Chinese Communist Party was somehow a developmental
Yeah,
miracle worker,
meritocratic, yes.
that was never true. What was true was that China's economy had been repressed for 200 years, starting with the Opium Wars, then with the civil wars in China, with the Taiping Rebellion, then with Western colonialism in the second half of the 20th century, and big parts of China being occupied by foreign countries, by Japanese colonialism in China, and the occupation of Manchuria, the war, which, remember, World War II in Japan started in 1932, or 32 or 36, depending when you want to time the Japanese invasion. Then there was the Civil War in China. Then there was Maoism, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. All of these disastrous policies kept the Chinese economy down. The minute that communist repression was lifted, and Xi Jinping just said, go out and make money, the Chinese economy suddenly started rebounding. Now, I want to stress it was a rebound, the same kind of rebound as, for example, Poland and Germany after 1945. It was a rebound from zero to its natural level of economic growth. And in Eastern Europe and for that matter, in Western Europe, in Germany, that took about 30 years. That is our historical cliometric analyses, historical economic analyses are that East Central Europe and Germany reached their trend growth potential only around 1975. And that's what resulted in the malaise. And we could argue with the collapse of communism that what was happening in the Khrushchev years and in the rapidly growing years of the 1960s and 70s was just recovery from World War II. It wasn't good communist policies. It was just recovery from World War II. And in the same way, China's policies from 1982 or so to 2017 weren't good economic policies. They were a lack of bad economic policies, just taking the lid off the economy. Well, Xi Jinping has now been putting the lid back on the economy.
Yes.
Right? For Xi Jinping, the priority has been maintaining the control of the Communist Party as being more important than fostering growth. But when we look at things, I mean, I'm going to give you some statistics that will simply shock you. The
Yes.
first one is that China still has not surpassed Mexico in GDP per capita. Okay, so China has been competing with Mexico to be an offshore manufacturing zone for the US economy, and it still has not surpassed Mexico in its manufacturing productivity. It's achieved parity with Mexico, but no one would say that Mexico's economic managers are brilliant managers who are just amazing and magical. So all China has done has been to become as good as Mexico.
And if I may say,
Yep.
citizens from both countries are immigrating as much as they can, as fast as they
Yes.
can to the US,
A-
both from
a- a-
Mexico and China. What a coincidence.
Absolutely,
Okay, sorry
absolutely.
for the
Okay,
interrupt.
second statistic that people just have no idea about. We all know that China-U.S. trade boomed between 1982 and 2016, 2017. Massive increase in China's exports to the United States. If you look at China's exports to the United States today, on a population-weighted basis, they are almost identical to China's share of the non-U.S. population. In other words, China has simply gone from having no exports to the United States under Mao to having its average expected exports to the United States. That is, what you would expect if it just exported at random. If the US imported at random from other countries in the world. So the whole China growth story has been a story of return to average, return to equilibrium. That's how I analyzed it in 2011. That's how I've continued to see it all through the 2010s. And I think that has now panned out. That is, we've seen China return to being a typical BRICS country, right? The BRICS was a great moniker. It captured the reality that these are just the typical state of the middle income world. Well, China's there.
Okay, since you predicted or foresaw the future in 2010, what do you see? How do you see the end of the decade starting now? Let's say still beginning of this decade. How do you see the end of the decade? Where do you see all of this going?
China has become an ordinary, corrupt middle income country with a high level of state interference in the economy, uh, poor market institutions, but poorly regulated, poorly governed market institutions, poorly institutionalized rule of law. That description would describe China. It would also more or less describe Mexico. Of course, Mexico doesn't have a totalitarian regime, but the economy is in many ways similar to Mexico's, similar to Brazil's, similar to Argentina's. And there's no reason to expect China to grow faster than these countries. All of these countries have had temporary growth spurts whenever the currency situation has benefited them. And then as their currencies overshoot, they've had stalling growth. So if you go back to the 1980s, you can repeatedly find articles about how Brazil will be the next economic giant. And it grows for 3-4 years and then it stops. So China's getting into that phase. China has simply stabilized at a global average growth rate, which is around 3% for developing countries. And plus or minus, that's where it's going to be, I think, in perpetuity at this point, because its government is unable to reform. And that's what distinguishes it, say, from Taiwan or South Korea. Those are countries that I would have said the same thing about, except that their governments reformed 40 years, 30, 35 years ago. The Chinese government shows no capacity for reform. Now, should it reform? Yes, things could change, but I see no signs that China is
Yes.
going to reform. India, on the other hand, is still much earlier in its growth curve. India's socialist, the planned economy in India was only ended. Well, ended. It only began to be reformed in
Yes.
1990. The reform started later, and the reform has been gradual. So India didn't have the same just take the top off and let everything happen. India has had a gradual
Hmm.
series of reforms that still are not as fully. India's economy still is not as fully open as China's was 5 years ago.
Yes.
So India's bounce back from planning has been slower. However, it has been much more consistent. I think India will continue to grow throughout the 2020s and 2030s, whichever party is in government in India. And I expect India will probably match China in GDP per capita, probably in the 2040s, by
Yes.
2050, but at
Still,
some
yeah.
point in the
What I
20.
heard from a Polish scholar who I also interviewed on my channel, he said it's like 2 or 3 decades behind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we believe
And
that China's growth has
yes.
stalled, and I've always believed that China's growth would stall at this level. Now, the difference is that India has democratic institutions that give the hope that India will continue to reform and continue to improve its institutions and its governance levels beyond what we see in the rest of the middle income world. That hasn't happened yet, but India has the potential for improving governance and rule of law, which means it has the potential to keep growing even after that point. But let's not try to predict what's going to happen in the 2050s. A lot could
Yeah,
happen between now and then.
one more question is, where do you see, in terms of like who dominate the region? Let's say within a decade, maybe 15 years. Do you think like in 15 years, would we see more of Indian influence in the region in Asia, or more of a still China would keep up the influence, or maybe it would switch?
So, what's the region? The Himalayas are, in practice, an impermeable barrier that separates South Asia from East Asia. There's some competition for influence in Myanmar, and it is potentially possible that Myanmar, which now probably on balance has more Chinese influence, could in the future have more Indian influence. Uh, that's up for grabs. But in South Asia itself, I think Indian influence is clearly on the rise. Now that means, in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, uh, Maldives, and then looking beyond that to the Middle East, India is certainly on the rise. Now,
Yes.
China is still very important in the Gulf states, but India, I think, is better trusted in the Gulf states. And then the key wild card, obviously, is Pakistan. Pakistan has, it was founded in 1947 in opposition to the idea of a unified India. It's invaded India 3 times. There's a nuclear standoff between Pakistan and India, and the Pakistan government faces a serious crisis of legitimacy with you know
Yes.
with serious problems. I mean,
Yes.
rampant inflation, a populist movement around Imran Khan threatening to overthrow the current government of Pakistan, the military being constantly involved in politics, and now adding to Pakistan's troubles, a Taliban government in Afghanistan that is very closely aligned with Taliban-like forces within Pakistan itself. So there are many possible outcomes for Pakistan. China has mostly withdrawn from active involvement in the country. Chinese nationals were being targeted in terrorist attacks. The Pakistan army has showed itself unable to defend Chinese businesses in Pakistan. Uh, what happens in Pakistan is a huge wild card, and I think it's something that the world should really be concerned about.
My last question. In my initial email, when I emailed you, you replied, "Oh, my three favorite countries: India, Poland, and Taiwan." You've been to Poland, I know, in 2016, 17. I've watched your videos.
Many times in Poland.
Yes, yes. Also in Kiev, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Kiev and
Okay.
Lviv,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then you've been to India. What about Taiwan? Have you been here, or are you planning to visit Taiwan?
Yeah, I spent 6 months as a
Oh,
Taiwan fellow at the Academia Sinica, and I still have a lot of friends at Academia
wow.
Sinica,
Cool.
National
Okay.
Taiwan University. I'm in contact with them. I used to visit Taiwan regularly when I used to travel to China regularly. So pre-COVID, I tried to visit Taiwan every year. I've been to Taiwan much more than I've ever been to India. In fact,
Oh,
I was initially studying India purely objectively through quantitative measures. I never even visited the country until November. So I have a long-standing relationship with Taiwan. I wrote several prominent articles about Taiwan for Foreign
Okay,
Affairs
I didn't know
and
that.
Foreign
So
Policy
you're actually
magazine.
more at Taiwan hand than at India hand.
Oh, well,
Yes.
I'm a longer term Taiwan hand
Yeah.
than an India hand. And of course, Taiwan has this fascinating history, and the question of to what extent is Taiwan Chinese versus Taiwanese, and we
Yes.
have a situation where Taiwan has become Taiwanese in part because of the threat from China. And in many ways, people make the Taiwan Ukraine comparison. I don't think the security situation is anything similar. I think the more interesting thing is the sociological situation is similar, where Russia's aggression in Ukraine has turned Ukrainians who might have otherwise been sympathetic to Russia into just a national consensus that Russia is the enemy. And I think in Taiwan we've seen the same phenomenon, that China's outrageous hostility towards Taiwan has turned most of the population into a simple feeling. Whereas 15 years ago in Taiwan there was a strong sense of many people having a Chinese identity, of the KMT promoting closer ties with China. We had the economic framework agreement between China and Taiwan that President who was fostering closer ties with China. That's inconceivable today. That is,
Yes.
even if the KMT were to win an election today, it couldn't politically bring things back there. And I think Russia lost Ukraine in the same way that China lost Taiwan, by being too aggressive in asserting its rights to the country. Great.
Again, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. It was really interesting.
Oh, thanks a lot. I'm always happy to do my bit for Poland.
Thank you very much.